We're delighted to have you, and we're very honored to have as our guest today and our speaker today the Reverend Kapya John Kaoma, who is from my favorite country in Africa, Zambia. And he has his doctorate in theology from Boston University, and he is an Anglican priest, which says a lot. He's been an interdisciplinary scholar, and he's been a visiting researcher at Boston University Center for Global Christianity and Mission. Reverend Kaoma has been involved in many different spiritual and academic pursuits and scholarship. He's the author of several books, including The Creation Care in Christian Mission, The Creator's Symphony, God's Family, God's Earth and Raised Hopes, and Shattered Dreams. But one of the things that I remember very well from my days in Zambia was that what we call the three mother churches, the Anglicans, the Catholics, and the evangelicals, were great allies on issues related to human rights and to democratization. They were a great moral force in the country. However, when I was there, we didn't agree on everything. And one of the things that we sometimes did not have exactly the same view on was the whole question of the rights of the LGBTQI plus community. And it happens that our guest today, Reverend Kaoma, is not only an expert on the subject, someone who has thought deeply about it and written about this subject, he is also an activist. And he's an activist on a side that isn't necessarily the easiest side, which is an advocate in favor of supporting the rights of the broad community, not just in Zambia, but throughout Africa. His subject today is a subject I think I'm very excited about this, as you can see. The subject today is intersectionality of human rights, democratization, and Christianity in African protective homophobia. This is an issue that I think we all struggle with to one degree or another. And Reverend Kaoma, I think, is one of the intellectual leaders on this subject, and certainly a person of great courage. So I hope that is not an excessive introduction for you, Reverend Kaoma. But with that, unless Eric has something else to say, we would be very happy to turn the floor to you and give you an opportunity to enlighten us on this subject that I think we all find very interesting.
Oh, you are muted.
I always do this.
You're not the only one.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the kind words. And thank you for being there for us in Zambia. And for everyone, thank you for coming to this. And to African Studies Center, I really owe a lot to the center during my studies at BU. I served at the center and got a scholarship from the center, so I'm really grateful for being there for me. Beth, I see you are on this at the library. Thank you for giving me a job when I really needed the money. So I have to acknowledge your presence today. So for those who are here, I think you all know about the issue of human rights for lesbians, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and intersex people in Africa. And you have come to this with some sort of knowledge or understanding of what has been going on. And I don't want to get into the system of making judgments today on how or what you think about it. What I thought of doing is first just to give you some of my thinking about this subject, because there are some myths out there. One of the myths which are being promoted is this, that Africans are just backward. That's how they believe or think about LGBTQ plus persons. Their opposition is because they are just backward. That is a myth I want us to dismiss. The second one is to think about African politicians as crazy when you hear them make statements which are outright crazy sounding about LGBTQ plus persons. Yeah, they make those statements, but they are not mad people, please, for God's sake. They are politicians. I want us to get that right. Then the third thing I want to say is, we all know that unlike in the West, Christianity and Islam, they have been growing so fast in Africa. And these two religions are missionary religions, meaning they grow with recruitment. And thus the question of procreation is so important to them. So when they are involved in the question of sexuality, they are not involved in it without religious interest. They have some incentives with it, looking at who is going to be our member tomorrow. And as such, some of their statements or their incentives for getting involved in these topics have to do with their growing membership. Having said that, I want us to start by rethinking what Africa has been in the past 3 decades, moving from the time when Africa was known to be a one party, or the time when Africa was led by dictators, to the democratized Africa when the West pushed so much for democracy across Africa. The replacement of dictatorship or one-party states to allowing people in Africa to start voting and having a say in issues that pertain to their governance. For better or for worse, what that did is to open the space for people's participation in politics, in governance. With it came the birth of the civil society. Among them were human rights groups, which fought so hard to ensure that the first nationalist groups that led to the birth of the one-party states or the independence of African countries died, or to this day face a lot of challenges which will lead to their death. If we are thinking of places like South Africa today or Zimbabwe being challenged and giving birth to new political parties, usually led by new breed or new politicians who are likely to be young, replacing what would term to be nationalist leaders. So with that, in most African countries, we had to have new leadership which ascribed to democratic governance and the birth of the civil society with human rights badges being given to them. The church was already seen to be part of the civil society, but the church had already been involved in the struggle for independence first. Missionaries played a very important role in fighting colonialism. During the first nationalist government, what had happened was the church became the de facto opposition in many African countries. It was the first movement that started challenging the nationalist leaders. In fact, a lot of religious leaders were killed for opposing nationalist leaders. I'm not saying that the church leaders were 100% opposed to the nationalist leaders, some participated in the oppression of their people, but there were a lot of them who died. We can talk about the number of religious leaders who died in Uganda, even in Zambia, who were killed or said to have been involved in accidents simply because they opposed the nationalist leaders. At the time when democracy was being reborn in the 90s, the churches were already fighting against the government. So when the civil society space was born, these churches were already there. And they just increased their power in national politics. By the time democracy was being born, we had another crisis, the HIV pandemic. And the HIV pandemic, for better or for worse, brought back the church in the civil society to partner with the international community to fight HIV. And the language was simple. It was ABC. That was the language that the church started using. And who were the culprits in the first days of the HIV pandemic? It was the LGBTQ. By that time, we don't talk about the G, the gay community, were the ones who were mostly associated with the pandemic of AIDS. As a result, the church emphasized abstinence, change of lifestyle, and a lot of money was pumped in fighting that. So the church got involved in sexual politics with the abstain only kind of teaching. These churches partnered with the Western countries. Money was given to them to start using to teach people to abstain. So there's democracy being born, the church is involved, money is given to the church. There is HIV prevention, money is given to the church. The church becomes a major actor in secular policy. When democracy is already born, we are going to have now a problem in 1998. Two things will take place. One was the Anglican Lambeth Conference, where the question of LGBTQ took place in England, with the African bishops from Nigeria opposing the acceptance of LGBTQ people. The same year, there will be a conference again by the World Council of Churches in Zimbabwe. And the question of LGBTQ people would be on the agenda. And unfortunately, those two events would bring about the activism that will push African churches to take a stand. The answer was already predetermined. The Western world thought Africans were opposed simply because they were backward. The Africans thought the Western world was forcing them to accept homosexuality because of their money, and the two groups could not talk, but they were being spoken for by outsiders, meaning groups with interests. And mostly the debate was fought in the media, but the two groups never really spoke. That led to two groups going two different ways. The Western world in the global Christianity had to continue with the acceptance of LGBTQ persons. The African world went away with the opposition to LGBTQ persons. And these two groups were not willing to talk as much, but were willing to fight without having to ask, why are we fighting and what are we fighting for? Until something would happen. And what was that? In America, the American church ordained or consecrated Bishop Gene Robinson. The African church in the Anglican Communion was very, very upset with that move. And the American groups felt, those who were opposed to LGBT rights, took that back to Africa and asked the Africans whether they were Anglicans or not to take a stand against homosexuality. And that was when the toothpaste was out of the tube. And African governments now were also forced to get involved. And the argument was, what has happened is due to the government's failure to take action to stop homosexuality. If the governments in Africa do not take a stand, Africa as a whole will do the same. Now we have to understand by that time that Robert Mugabe had already made some statements against of Zimbabwe, against LGBTQ persons in 1998. But to 2003, it became very easy for him. He had become unpopular. And African leaders now started singing the same song of, we don't want gays here. Gays are supposed to be in America. And every unpopular politician started singing anti-gay songs. And all Africans will say homosexuality belongs to the West. We Africans don't have homosexuality. But how do they then ask their populations to support the move? We go back to democracy. Yes, in churches, they will argue that the Bible is against homosexuality because they were told how to do it by interpreting scriptures which they thought were in agreement to them. But how would they get their churches to become anti-LGBTQ? The only way they would get them to do that was not just to end with the Bible, but also to go beyond it by partnering with other churches outside, meaning the churches that had already opposed the LGBTQ people in the West. And this is where the game became very, very interesting, because the material that African churches started using to oppose LGBTQ was not made in Africa at all. The material that Africans started using was made in the USA, but read in Africa. To this day, the literature that most Africans use, or the language they use to oppose LGBTQ rights, is coming from the United States of America. It reads the same in Zambia, it reads the same in Kenya, it reads the same in Malawi, in Nigeria, in Sudan, because the people who are promoting or who are supplying this are groups based in America that are opposed to LGBT. For the Africans, the answer is the same. Homosexuality is an African, just like an American would argue that homosexuality is against American culture. It is against Christianity. So an African would argue homosexuality is un-Christian. Fighting it is about the soul of America. Fighting it is about saving the soul of Africa. All they are doing is replacing America for Africa. that the playbook is all the same. Homosexuality is destroying the family. That language is just duplicated the same way. It is against traditional family, is the same. However, the meaning differs. When we speak of the traditional family, the Africans who were once colonized, their understanding of traditional family is totally different from an American. Whereas an American will be thinking of father and mother and children, an African is thinking about my grandfather, my brother, my uncle, my sister. So those are the things that are being assaulted by Westernization or colonialism and globalization. So to me, as an African, the reason I'm fighting homosexuality is totally different from the reason an American is fighting it, but the language sounds the same. Then we go back to how do we fight it? We have to go back to the table of democracy. The majority of Africans will argue that the majority of our people don't want it. So let's go and vote. And for sure, many Africans will vote against homosexuality, making it legally unacceptable. To make an argument that it is a human right is one thing. To make it an argument that it is legally unacceptable is another. And I think this is an argument that most Westerners fail to understand. The Africans are making a democratic argument that the majority of Africans, if we talk about Nigeria, 92% of them voted against homosexuality, and they will win if we put it to a vote. Therefore, you gave us democracy, and you told us that whatever the majority agree on is right. And the majority do not want it, therefore, it is wrong. To reverse the argument that the majority have the right to protect the minority rights, an African won't agree. And this is where the intersectionality between African protective homophobia and sexual rights for LGBTQI+ persons comes into play. The system that we are using, or the Western world asked Africa to embrace, is coming to haunt it again when it comes to the rights of the minority. Yes, we can make argument after argument, but until we revisit what we meant by majority rights to rule themselves and to determine their destiny amidst the human rights of the minority, voting as the way of determining right and wrong will continue to hinder the human rights for LGBTQI+ human beings in Africa. Is it right? No. Democracy is supposed to protect the rights of the minority, and rightly so. But democracy that is not rightly defined from the beginning becomes the tool to oppress those who are in the minority, and in this case, the LGBTQ+ individuals. This is true to minority tribes across Africa. This is true to the minority religious groups on the continent. It is time for us to start asking, are Western models of governance the best to the realization of human rights for all people? Or is it time for us to pause and ask, what can be done to revisit how we define human rights in relation to democracy, and democracy in relation to human rights in the globalized world? Africa has a long history of colonialism, and that colonialism continues to affect how it relates to governance, to human rights, to democracy, and to self-understanding. And I believe that until those areas are decolonized, and I mean even the same language of democracy is decolonized from the Western mind, the rights of LGBTQI plus persons will continue to be contested and defended on the false premise of democracy. And the only thing we can hope for is what we are seeing in the courts, where at times the courts are ruling in favor of transgender individuals, in favor of intersex individuals. Again, it is when we stop using terms like homosexuality, but go on to use terms that are defined. Rather than speaking of LGBTQI, we start talking about intersex persons and define that in simple language that Africans will understand by saying we are defending rights of human beings who are born with both genitals, male and female, young babies who are born in different bodies, those they can identify and see on a daily basis, as opposed to using these acronyms. Probably Africa will move or will be decolonized from this growing or a protective homophobia. And let me end by that very term, protective homophobia. I have coined this one for one reason. Africa wants to protect itself from accountability, because like a beaten child over and over again, Africa wants to be protected from its own ills. You gave us this, now you want to take it away. Yes, you gave us democracy, you want to take it away by telling us what the majority thinks about an issue does not matter. Yes, you gave us Christianity, you gave us the Bible, they claim, you gave us the Quran, they will claim, and the Quran says homosexuality is a sin. Now you want to take it away. For that reason, Africa becomes the defender of the document or the ideology of democracy that you gave to them, even when, for instance, the Bible or Christianity itself, the Western world has dumped it, yet Africa will protect it. It is the most valued ideology today. And Africa is willing to die for it. It's on us to decolonize sexual politics and make it an African, so as to speak to a decolonized African mind. Thank you.
Reverend Kaoma, thank you so much for your comments. You've given us a lot to think about. I'm sure that we're going to have a lot of questions from the folks who are tuning in, especially via Zoom. I don't know if you'll permit, may I ask a first question?
Yes, please.
And there are many things I would like to ask you about, but I'll start with something relatively simple. I was fascinated by your description of the impact of HIV and how this made some connections between various African communities and communities that were homophobic in the United States. But it also sounded like you were saying they really weren't saying the same things. They had different views of family, different views of society. Could you explain a little bit about how that connection was made? Was it made through actual visits? People knowing one another? Was it done through the media somehow? Was it done through the internet, through books? How did that contact happen, and is it still happening?
Thank you. I think one of the biggest thing that took place or has taken place from the beginning of Christianity is Christianity has got a fraternity, even Islam, all right, which goes back to their founding. These religions have always exchanged not just ideas, but bodies. It is how they exist. So if there are religions that value body contacts, Christianity and Islam are among them. So long, even before this, the missionary movements were like that, even going back to the early beginnings of the church, for instance, we see it happening. So what happened, or what started happening is we had missionaries moving from the US going to Africa. The good thing that took place, I don't know if you remember, there was that time when President Bush was in Zambia and President Michael Sata talked about him being a colonialist, and President Bush said, we didn't colonize Africa, and then he hit back.
I was with them when that happened.
Okay, so
don't forget that. It was pretty amusing.
But the missionaries, we don't consider them as colonialists, all right? Because for us, that is brotherhood and sisterhood. That's how the churches exist. So as a result, the missionaries would move between the two. And unfortunately, the thing that had happened long even before that was we had movement of ideologies and bodies. I am here today because of the very partnership where young promising Africans were brought to the US to study in the US and then sent back to Africa. So there was that already happening. You know, we do have a lot of young men who became politicians in Africa who are pastors. We are trained by US evangelicals, for instance, or right-wing groups. So there was already that part. And a lot of missionaries were involved in fighting HIV. And that has continued. They are what we call short-term missionaries. That has continued. Then came to one of the good things that happens again with the missionaries or missionary movements is that there is they have literature. Sharing of literature is a gift, and they invest in literature more than the human rights groups would. To be honest with you, I tell people who complain, for a good, well thought out book by a good scholar to be found in an African school or library, you can ask Beth how much it will cost. It's so expensive for anyone who is listening to me, your book to be found in an African library, you like it or not. African schools won't afford to buy it. But for the junk of somebody who is publishing from his house, those books will be found across Africa. That's the reality of life, unfortunately. So there is body movements. There is also literature involved in here for free. So those are still happening to this day. Now, when it comes to that, because they are funded and they have reasons to move, they can go. There is what I call residue colonialism. And that, Ambassador, you know, all right? It can take me, and it will take me 100 years to get an appointment with my own president. But it will take 5 minutes for a white high school student to make an appointment to see my president in Africa, as long as he's white. That's how it works. White means something in Africa up to this date. So what a white person says carries more power. That's why all African presidents like taking pictures with white people, because having a white person, you know that, Ambassador, it is a sign of power. You know, a professor can, as long as he's black, doesn't carry weight to an African president. But a white boy from high school, the African president will tweet that picture. It's how it is. So he's a white pastor. Whatever they tell them is true. I was taught by a white man. Even if it's a lie, the white man said it.
I'm sure we're going to pursue this more in the questions, the whole question of colonialism. I'm fascinated by your term of decolonization of democracy. I hope people will ask about that more. But Eric, can we turn to questions from our participants today?
Yeah, so feel free, those of you who are in the room, first of all, raise your hands, but also those of you who are on Zoom, of course, you can raise your hand. The raise hand feature is under the reactions tab on the bottom of your screen, and then you can click raise hand and we can call on you. Elsa, did you have a question?
Yeah. Yep. I'm actually going to speak to what you raised. I really appreciate the thought-provoking and very groundbreaking language and framing and epistemological framing around challenging the limits of democracy as it has been imported from the West. And so I'm curious how you, in your work with different groups on the ground, what are some of the imaginaries that groups are putting forth to envision that decolonized polity, if you will? What does a decolonized democracy look like? And I use the word imaginary because I know that systemic change is slow in the making, but it starts with having new visions for social change. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about how that is defined by activists on the ground in terms of their visions for the future.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of the biggest problem, I don't want to call it a problem. One of the biggest challenge is that when the Western world talks about democracy, what they didn't tell us or tell Africa is that they had various models of democracy, all right? And that it played differently in different settings. The democracy in America is totally different from democracy in England, where they have a monarchy. And it will be different in Canada, where they don't have the different kind of houses like they have in America. So that was not something, and in Germany, where they don't have the similar kind, and the terms and everything like that. They didn't have one form of how to look at it. Everything grew organically based on a different context. The way they count votes or who matters in a decision, those things were not necessarily the same word. So what was made for us is what it was more about count the votes, and the majority what they want is what wins, which didn't take into consideration is what happens if the majority are voting on something that affects the minority. That was not taken into consideration. How do the minority get their voices registered in a majority country, for instance? That never played into African democracy. So we have situations like, let's talk about the Sani people. And I'm talking about in Namibia and in South Africa itself. Those are small ethnic groups, all right? How do they get their voices heard? For sure, they will never have a party that will get there on the table. So to simply say that they form a political party or that wouldn't work. But this transplanting of models, by the way, is what has led Africa to where it is. My book, Raise the Hope, Shattered Dreams, is all about that. I don't blame African politicians. I blame the structures. What happened at independence or what happened to democracy is at independence, Africans just sat where colonialists were yesterday. We just replaced where a white person sat yesterday. All right? And he called him the same term. We just changed the faces. Nothing changed. And as a result, we expect them to be accountable? No. It's the same system. It's only that we shifted. We threw out a white person and put a black person there. And that's why nothing changes. You can change them, but it will be the same story over and over again. We never decolonize the structures of governance at all. And so is democracy. What we sent the word, but we never thought through what are we really talking about. So my imagination could be like this, where we say, now this may sound crazy. People tell me at times I think like a crazy person. And I say, why not? All right, because even the guys who started this whole system were crazy, but they managed to convince crazy enough people to think, let's try it, all right? Because I don't understand American democracy either. I think it's crazy, but people believed it. So here is my thinking, all right? Why should we just end by saying we have the parliament and whatever they pass is right, all right? And I'm told there are people who say, okay, proportional representation. I said, that's good, okay, let's talk about that, that's okay. But there should be another house that should be dealing with minority concerns. And that house must be respected because that's where all of us should be going. And what that house tells us is holding all people equally so that all of us can be heard. But if we don't have that minority, the house which will be taking all the concerns of people equally, then those of us who are fighting for minority issues will never be heard. Currently, we don't have, and you say, go and vote. Yes, I can vote. But you say the High Court, I say, but for me to get there, I know what they're gonna do. They are packing people who are going to advance their cause. And we know that. So reimagination to me is the engine of decolonized democracy. We have to reimagine something new in Africa. Now, in each country, I believe there should be a different model. And each country should come up with a different model. And this patch-up constitution made by the West, all right? Can you fix your own mess first before going to Africa? I mean it. When are you gonna leave Africa alone to fix its own mess? You have messes here. Deal with your own electoral college mess, which I don't even understand.
You're not alone on that one.
Thank you, Rodney Kaoma.
I'm sorry, but I just have to say that. No, I like the language of imagination, but we have to do it, and radically so. But I'm gonna be called crazy. And the answer is it won't work. And the answer is what tells you it won't work because I haven't tried it anyway. But what we have is not working either.
Do we have some questions from the field?
I don't see any hands up in the on Zoom right now. If anyone on Zoom would like to ask a question, feel free to jump in.
I have a question.
Or else we'll turn to Dave. Yeah.
Thank you for a really fascinating talk. I'm curious, You talked a lot about how this homophobia was imposed.
Would you mind saying so that everyone knows who you are?
Oh, yes, sorry. I'm Dave Blovsky. I just started in the history department here at BU. I'm curious, how does this sort of imposed homophobia that is, of course, then adapted and used by politicians and others, how does that go along with or intersect with other sort of imposed ideas of gender or sexuality that came both during colonial times and afterward? Because so much of this of current ideas of gender and sexuality and family structures and things like that are things that shifted during the 20th century.
Thank you. So, and thank you for that. Originally, the question of gender, the laws in most African countries, especially English-speaking Africa, we had those laws which came with the crazy guy called King Henry VIII, canon knowledge against nature. All right. Whatever it means, I don't know. No one even knows. So those laws were on the books. Again, this is a good way of understanding, but they were never used. They were just there, okay? And every constitution would just leave it in the penal code. Never used, people are never arrested until the 2010 going upward. That's when they started using them. Going back to the question I was raising about the 1990s, the 3 decades. So they were revived after it became a political issue. As I said, African leaders are not lunatics, for God's sake. They want votes, all right? So they know the thing that will win them votes. For those who want to say, oh, African politicians are just said, no. Even here in America, they do the same. They will say things that will get them voted in, all right? If they know that 87% of their population is Christian, what will stop them from quoting the Bible and then denouncing or demeaning their fellow human beings? They will use it, all right? Do they really believe it? If you talk to them separately, they will tell you something different, okay? It happens. Talk to a bishop in their house, they'll be saying something totally different. So the imported homophobia, what happens is this: when people take these statements out, they take them to politicians who are mostly, when their reign is threatened, when they're about to lose their pay attention, when they know that they're about to be voted out, they are likely to paint their opponents as being sponsored by gay persons, all right? And then they will use that as a way of saying homosexuals are supporting my opponent. So if they win, then you are going to have homosexuals will be running your country. That's how the game is played. The religious leaders also do the same. They want to take national prominence. So what they will do, they will jump on that to start associating with the politician so as to be seen to be in power. When this politician wins, then I'll be next to him. So they are both winning in the process. It's not like these guys are just doing it from no other reason. They are political actors. They have something to benefit from homophobia. I'm not saying that Africa is not opposed to homosexuality. What I'm trying to say is, it is not an issue that will make an African not go to bed, all right? Africans know they are gay persons. Neither do the Africans. If you ask an African, what is your view about abortion? The answer is, they can tell you maybe, oh, so what? Do you know anyone who has aborted? Yes, I know 8 of them. So if you think it's murder, why didn't you take them to the police? Oh, it's none of my business, all right? So Africans do all these things. They have their own position, they don't care. But once you bring them as political issues, then they are used just to mobilize, as mobilizing factors in the political realm. They are not necessarily issues that will make somebody not go to bed. Whoever will tell you, they are lying. That's why African countries, the Maputo Protocol was passed with no opposition from African nations, simply because it is not an issue to Africa. But when these groups, the US group specifically, took it on them by saying that gays are the ones who are promoting abortion in Africa, we've seen the pushback again on the Maputo Protocol. Were they all given some marijuana, African leaders, when they adopted it? No. So it is this misrepresentation of position, saying that gays are the ones doing A, B, C, D. Let me give an example. Look, I don't even know why people want to say Africans are crazily involved in gay politics to an extent that they want to murder somebody for doing A, B, C, D. The point is simple. They do that because they are being misled into thinking about a gay person. Frank Mugisha once told me, this a gay activist in Uganda, that he was flying to Kampala and sat with next to a woman. And the woman was talking about this gay person in Uganda who is so dangerous and should stay away from him, you know, he's able to destroy people. Then Frank said, I'm Frank Mugisha. The woman said, no, you are so good to be gay. They have painted a gay person as this evil person, so a demon. The real gay person, people don't know. That's why African nations, in all the laws being passed today, they are stopping advocacy on gender and advocacy on gender identity and advocacy on gay rights. Because once people meet a gay human being, their positions change. So all the laws being passed in African countries, it will stop the visibility of a gay person. Because people, once they know who a gay person is, they change their mind. They realize he can be my brother, she can be my sister. So stop talking about them, because if we see them, then we realize they can be my brother, they can be my sister.
Okay, thank you for that. Any other questions that have popped up?
I have another question. We can answer there.
So a question just came in via the chat. Maybe I can read it, unless Beth, unless you would like to jump in. This is Beth Woods, not Beth Restrict. I don't know, Reverend Kaoma, if you saw from Beth Restrict. She just said that it was good to see you, but she had to jump off for another meeting.
I can read my question, Eric. So Reverend Kaoma, thank you first of all for your very well articulated talk. I was very, first of all, my name is Beth Woods. I'm a third year PhD student studying West African literature and film. And I focus on Senegal, which is a largely Islamic country. And so I was very interested in the similarities that you touched on between Islam and Christianity and how they've been used to change and shape African society in terms of LGBTQ rights. I was wondering if you could speak more about both their similarities and maybe some differences in terms of their relationship with LGBTQ rights and decolonization.
Thank you. In fact, I have a section which I didn't speak much about Islam. So the good example I can give is there is a part of what happened what happened in Ghana first. where the Islamic authorities and Christian authorities, that's the only topic they agree on, to be honest with you. When it comes to everything else, they can fight and demean each other. But on question of LGBTQ rights, that's why they call each other brothers and sisters. Even in American Christian rights or right-wing politics, the US right-wing politics can call whatever they want Iran to be a demon or whatever. But when it comes to LGBTQI plus people and rights, they meet together to organize against them at the UN. So you can see the same kind of partnership on this issue. They all come together when it comes to defending the family, as they call it. They work together. They are just married. And their argument is they see the LGBTQ plus persons as destroying the foundation of the family as they know it, as we know it. That's the language they would use. So what are they very much afraid of? Partially, they say that, coming back to the question of gender, you hear the language they use mostly is the question of gender ideology. What they mean by that is what they started with Jennifer Butler's language of gender ideology, which they have tried to attack. But they claim that when we use the word gender ideology, we are trying to say that every person, every child can choose the gender of their own liking. In actual fact, they are trying to attack the trans community. Among them, in fact, is the famous and most loved Pope Francis, who has tried to marry that as well. In fact, they met at the Vatican to talk about anti-gender ideology, because they believe that women movement is trying to say children can change their gender, and that is the part of the homosexual international agenda, which Pope Francis has called colonization. He calls it gender colonization, ideological colonization. So this ideology now has gone to be used by Muslims and Christian right-wing groups, both in the Islamic countries and in the US and Africa. Now, in terms of the reaction, the interesting thing that has come up in their work is that in Ghana, they work as a team, including on the bill that has been discussed in Parliament there, which is being discussed in Parliament there, against so-called proper human rights, opposed to LGBT rights, but for proper human rights. That bill, the Muslims were involved. The same thing happened in Nigeria, the Muslims were also involved. So the groups are working together, even though they can see each other as competitors in terms of their beliefs. But on LGBTQ issues, these groups are the same. Do they have the same exchange of ideas? I wouldn't say yes, or in terms of coming from the US, but what is interesting is this, that they have almost the same kind of inflow of information where they cite each other. So you hear Christians in Africa saying that even our Muslim scholars say A, B, C, D. So as also the Muslims saying the same thing about Christians opposing LGBTQ rights. So you see that exchange of inflow of information where they are citing what each other region is saying about this issue.
Thank you. Is there another question on Zoom? Elsa, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Yeah.
Sure. Um, your presentation, Reverend Kaoma, made me think of the provocative Joseph Massad's work in the early 2000s, where he criticized the imposition of Western LGBTQI versions of what it means to be gay onto the Arab world, and sort of a decolonial pushback against that, and also not only what it means to be gay, but also what it means to fight for LGBTQI rights. So I was curious what your position is and your suggestions are for international groups, Western groups outside Africa who seek to support LGBTQI rights on the continent. Do they risk reproducing another form of imperialism and colonialism, and what is your position on that vis-a-vis international groups?
Thank you for that question. I have always said to the people, and I think the ambassador will agree with me on this, that the best thing to do in every situation is humility, not arrogance. Because this is how I start by answering your question. I will start by a simple answer. And the question, this is how I start. Whenever I'm asked in different settings, I'll say, how many of you Americans have read American history and read a book written by an African about America in your class?
Yeah.
Not very many is the answer.
How many of you have read and learned about Africa and read a book written by an American?
Almost, I'm assuming all of us.
Everyone in this room.
Yeah.
There you go. That's where the problem begins. And there are a lot of Africans who have lived in America for so long, but they are not experts on America. The point I'm trying to raise is humility is a good teacher. One of the mistakes which are made is that when you go into another land, you got to go as a companion. Learn from them, because at times you can cause more harm than good. And most of these problems are caused because of the same problem. I remember the time when there was the case of two young men in Zambia who were arrested. And during the ambassador's time in Zambia. And Dr. Biden, she was going to Zambia, and I was with her, and she asked me, what should we do? And I told her, don't say anything publicly about it. Go to the wife of the president and have a talk with her in private and say, you are a mother. Can you do something about these boys? So you think that will work? I said, just do that. Don't say anything aloud. She didn't leave Zambia. Those boys were released from the jail. All right? She didn't leave Zambia. The boys were released from the jail. There is a lot we can do, but we need to go and learn how to go about it. Mostly when you say people, you come out as gay. I've heard people say, we went to Africa and 10 people came out as gay, and they say, so what? Do you know what you have done to those kids? Yes, here you are individualistic. There, it doesn't work that way. Those kids belong to a family. Now, if you cut them from the family support, what are they going to remain with? All right? So to come out is not as easy as just saying, I am gay. that's not the way it works. All right? It is not, they need the family around them. So it to be, I hear people jumping up and down. And I said, no, what is needed is to understand the social location in which you are, number one. Number two, activism does not always mean making noise. At times, what it means is equipping the people to do the right thing. But I know that most of the funders, they want to see, oh, we want to see the pictures. And I say, sometimes you don't need pictures, because those pictures can be death traps. And it's time the Western world understood that. I tell funders every time, this system of take pictures is times a death trap. In Zambia, you cannot, and I mean it, in my country. Yeah, in Uganda, you can have. People think Uganda is a dangerous place to be gay. No, I tell people that's a lie. The most dangerous place to be gay is Zambia. You cannot have a gay pride parade in Zambia. You'll be dead. Where are you going to start from? You can have it in Uganda, not in Zambia. So to say you want funding to go and parade to be gay in Zambia, I say, go ahead. You'll be lucky if you're going to take 2 steps. All right? So the point is, you need to learn from the local people, number one. We need to learn the language to use. As I'm saying, every context is different. So for the groups that are working on Africa on this issue, some of us, like myself, I'm useless, all right? I have to tell you the truth. I break my own rules every time I give good advice. But when I'm in there, I lose it and I become but I don't care. Don't listen to me and don't follow me. Don't go with me because you'll be in trouble. However, I tell people, if you are going to go with me, know that I'm going to break every rule. But you go in there, learn from the people. You are very important to hold their hand. Let them do the rest. Hold their hand. They need you. Please do not be afraid to go out there. They need your hand. Hold their hands. They need you to tell their story to the world. Maybe that is the only thing you can do for them, is to watch and tell their story to the world. That is the greatest gift you can give as an outsider, as an ally. And let us fight the battle ourselves, because we'll win it one day and we'll smile. And I'll be going there in November.
Reverend Kaoma, I have to say, I really appreciate what you just said. And I wish you could speak to many American embassies in Africa. So, any more questions? No? Reverend Kaoma, would you like to have any final thoughts about anything that you would like to share with us all?
Yeah, so may I just say some more things I wanted to say? Because I didn't mention this from the beginning. The issues of LGBT activism on the continent is wide. There's a lot of literature out there talking about it. It is as complex as you can make it to be. We do have a lot of scholars working on it. And I am excited about the number of scholars working on this issue from different perspectives. The religious angle is wide, but my own interest in this is informed by various issues. One is the exploitation, then the decolonization, and the international relational issue, which I didn't talk about. And I want just to highlight that, especially between governments, because one of the aspects we have seen is where nations are having to deal with it on a different level. We see a lot of this going on and off. the bigger one is what is the role of the US government in Africa's LGBTQ liberation, as I would call it. There is also another side to it. It is to do with what message at times the US government tend to send on these issues. Currently, we do have the mixed messages being sent, which is not very helpful, especially from the Biden administration. I'm really disappointed because the Zambian situation, as I'm speaking, is no one knows where our government is, and it is just a mess. But the Biden administration continues to more like say it's okay that the president can continue to say negative things about LGBT persons and then being hosted twice now at the White House. I don't think that's a good thing. It is just so embarrassing to do that. If he believes that gay rights, as he says, are human rights, and human rights are gay rights, then he should stand by one thing. The Obama administration did that and it worked. But if the mistake the US government makes is thinking that by softening to African leaders, then African leaders will love them. The point is clear. The African leaders know there is no way they will love the US regardless when it comes to LGBT issues. They know them, they know their US ambassadors, what they stand for. They know that the US government is pro-gay. That is well known. So it doesn't even change anything by simply saying, this is where we stand, this is our government stance, and you repeat it when the governments are there. What that does is it gives people, the LGBT community, something to stand on. The second thing I want to say is, for academics, when we have a chance, we do have a role to play in this. When you are writing on if you can write on this issue, please don't just send your books to your friend. Consider sending your good book to African libraries for free. They need to see the other side of this topic. Until people know the truth or the other topic, they will never know. So we need to start giving them the alternatives. Then finally, may I just say that don't overjudge the other without listening to them. Generally, we are made and we are informed by different factors. In Africa today, there is a lot of talk about gays raping kids, abusing kids, what they mean are boys. But there's also a lot of talk about girls being abused. The problem has been that in African context, raping a girl is viewed at times as normal, all right? Because she's a girl. Whereas raping a boy is abnormal. So the boy, even though it doesn't happen that often, becomes a national scandal. For the girl, it is normalized. And my work has been to push back on that narrative as don't look at gay persons as much evil than straight men who rape girls, all right? Because I think that's another mistake that is made in this narrative. And my goal is to try and put them together at once. So those are the things that I want to say. And let me just end by saying this to you. The game of decolonization won't end with me. It needs each one of us to do our part. And as somebody said in this group, we have to reimagine a new continent where democracy has to be rethought for Africa to make sense for LGBT persons. And that to happen will demand new scholarship and new vision for a better world. Do I believe it is possible? yes, even those who gave us what we have today, we are reimagining the world, and we can do it too. Thank you.
Reverend Kapya Kaoma, thank you so much. Zikomo Kwambiri. You've shared with us, honestly, I have to say, it was a fascinating discussion, very informative for me, and full of wisdom that I hope our listeners will all pay attention to.